You walk through the shadowed halls of Whitehall Palace, where the most feared King of England drew his final breath. Outside, a storm raged over the palace, as if the heavens themselves rose in judgment. The throne of power that once held him now stood in silence, waiting for the next to claim it. His crown, once a shield of authority, could not protect him from the rot consuming his flesh. He had once been a golden prince, young, vibrant, majestic, a man who bent kingdoms to his will. But age twisted his glory into torment. His swollen body became a prison, haunted by ghosts of wives and enemies alike. On his deathbed, surrounded by trembling physicians and whispering courtiers, Henry VIII was no longer a king, but a prisoner of pain. Around him, whispers grew louder, waiting, watching, as the Lion of England lost his roar. Like a candle burning low, his life flickered, each breath weaker than the last. He reached for his crown one final time, but his hand fell short. Death had claimed the king who once defied even God. And then, silence. The mighty Henry VIII was gone, but the horror of his death was only the beginning of his legacy. What truly killed Henry VIII, and what secrets did his body take to the grave? Stay with us as we uncover the horrible death of a king. Before he was a king, Henry Tudor was a fugitive. He was not born for glory. He was not even meant to wear England's crown. Henry Tudor, a boy of half-Welsh blood, was raised in shadows, hunted for a claim to the throne that was more fragile than glass. The Wars of the Roses had torn England apart for decades. Noble houses plotted and betrayed one another, and the Tudors were little more than pawns. As a young man, Henry lived not in palaces but in exile. He wandered foreign courts, always with one eye over his shoulder, for fear of being betrayed to the Yorkists who ruled England. His very name carried danger. He was a reminder of rebellion, of the rival claim that might one day rise again. He spent nearly 14 years in Brittany and France, not as a celebrated prince, but as a guest easily traded away if politics demanded it. Imagine his world, corridors thick with whispers, doors that never felt safe, a boy forced to act older than his years. Every knock on the door might have been a soldier come to drag him to the Tower of London. Every smile from a French noble might have hidden the price of betrayal. Henry Tudor grew up knowing the taste of fear before he ever knew the taste of power, and yet, fear sharpened him. Exile hardened his spirit. The boy who might have been broken by uncertainty instead learned the art of patience. He studied alliances, measured loyalties, and carried his crown not on his head but deep within his heart. By the time fortune turned in his favour, Henry was no longer the frightened boy of exile. He was a man forged in waiting, a man prepared to gamble everything on one desperate chance, the chance to seize England itself. On the morning of the August 22nd, 1485, the fate of England lay in the mud of Bosworth Field. The air was thick with mist, the kind that clings to the throat and makes the ground slick beneath iron boots. Henry Tudor stood at the edge of the destiny. Not a seasoned warrior, not a crowned monarch, but a man with only one gamble left. Before him stretched the forces of Richard III, the reigning King of England, fierce and unrelenting. Behind Henry stood an army patched together with promises, foreign mercenaries and desperate men who believed this one chance might change history. For Henry, this was not just a battle, it was a test of survival. If he lost, he would not simply fall in combat, he would vanish, remembered only as another failed pretender. If he won, the blood-soaked crown of England would rest upon his brow. The clash began with thunderous roars, steel crashing, horses screaming, arrows darkening the sky. Men fell into the mud, their cries swallowed by the chaos. Henry was no mighty knight. He did not ride with shining armour into the thick of combat. Instead, he manoeuvred carefully, watching, waiting, searching for the moment when courage and opportunity would align. That moment came when Richard III, defiant and furious, spotted Henry across the battlefield. In a sudden surge of reckless valour, the king spurred his horse forward, cutting through Henry's guards in a desperate charge. Witnesses would later say Richard fought like a man possessed, striking down foes with a fury that seemed to defy death itself. Henry's life hung on a thread. One wrong step, one failed defence, and the Tudor cause would bleed out into the mud. But fate, or perhaps loyalty, intervened. At the very moment Richard closed in, Lord Stanley's forces, long undecided, finally chose their side. With a sudden rush, they surrounded the king, dragging him from his horse. The crown was not won by Henry's sword, but by betrayal. Richard III was cut down in the mud, his body mutilated and stripped, his crown found upon a thorn bush. And in that moment, as the blood of kings mixed with the earth, Henry Tudor became Henry VII, the unlikely victor, the last man standing in a war of roses that had shattered England for decades. Yet even as the shouts of victory rose, Henry's heart was not free. Victory had been bought with treachery, and deep inside he knew the same betrayal that destroyed Richard could one day come for him. Victory had given Henry the throne, but it had also chained him to a lifetime of fear. The cheers of Bosworth had hardly faded when the weight of the crown settled heavy on Henry's brow. To the people, he was a saviour, an end to decades of bloodshed. But to Henry himself, he was nothing more than a man standing in a storm, waiting for the next betrayal. Every corner of England whispered of rivals. The Yorkist cause was not dead, merely wounded. Pretenders lurked in exile. Foreign kings sharpened their blades, and even those who bent the knee to him did so with eyes full of calculation. Henry's throne was not built on loyalty. It was built on the shifting sands of fear, promises and fragile alliances. At night, sleep seldom came. When it did, it came in fragments, torn apart by visions of Richard's dying eyes, the scream of horses, the clash of steel. He would wake in a sweat, convinced that shadows moved in his chamber, that daggers glinted in the dark. Even in triumph, paranoia gnawed at his bones. He ordered spies in every court, messengers in every tavern. He trusted no man fully, not even those closest to him. His mind returned again and again to the truth of Bosworth. The battle was not won by valour, but by betrayal. If Richard could fall to treachery, so could he. The crown was his, but it didn't feel like a gift. It was a chain of iron, binding him to endless suspicion. Every smile hid a threat. Every ally carried the scent of danger. Henry VII, the unlikely king, had won his throne in blood, but in his heart he would forever wear a crown of shadows. He had survived the battlefield, but could he survive the silence that followed? The marriage of Henry VII to Elizabeth of York was painted as a love story, a union of two roses, red and white, binding the bloody wars of England into peace. But behind the carefully staged smiles, the truth was far colder. Elizabeth was the daughter of Edward IV, a Yorkist princess with the weight of a vanquished dynasty pressed upon her shoulders. For Henry, she was not simply a bride, but the very seal of his shaky legitimacy. Without her, his crown was a prize forever questioned. With her, he could claim destiny itself had ended the war. Imagine the halls of Westminster that winter of 1486, silk banners hanging heavy with dew, courtiers whispering with suspicion. They spoke of a new age, but their eyes said otherwise. This was no fairy tale, but a pact sealed in duty and blood. Elizabeth walked to her wedding not as a woman cherished, but as a hostage of politics. Her fate was bound not by love, but by the necessity of survival. And Henry, though outwardly stern and triumphant, felt the tremor of fear within him. Would her Yorkist blood be the spark that reignited rebellion? This union, so celebrated, was in truth a fragile bridge, one misstep away from collapse, and both Henry and Elizabeth knew it. Marriage to Elizabeth gave Henry the symbol he desperately needed, but it did not erase the ghosts of treachery. In the candlelit chambers of the palace, Henry's paranoia whispered to him louder than the vows of his bride. He feared betrayal in every glance. Every Yorkist supporter who once fought against him, every noble who bowed too slowly, became a shadow lurking at the edge of his throne. Even Elizabeth, though silent and obedient, was a reminder of a dynasty that once ruled with power far greater than his. The royal marriage bed, so often painted in romance, was in Henry's court a battlefield of politics. Elizabeth's womb was his fortress. Every child she bore was a weapon to secure his dynasty. When Prince Arthur was born, cries of joy filled the palace, yet Henry's heart was not at peace. He knew how easily such fragile heirs could be snatched away by illness, by betrayal, by God's indifference. Elizabeth endured it all quietly, draped in jewels, smiling in portraits, yet carrying the weight of chains no artist dared to paint. The roses of Tudor propaganda bloomed bright on parchment and banners, but in reality they concealed thorns of suspicion, grief, and fear. Henry's marriage was less a sanctuary than a prison built of necessity. A prison that both he and Elizabeth shared, bound together in silence. Over the years, Henry and Elizabeth's union appeared steady, almost serene. But beneath the polished veneer lived a storm of fragility. Each royal birth strengthened the Tudor line, yet each death of a child hollowed the Queen further. Elizabeth wept in private, while Henry turned his grief into tighter control, stricter measures, harsher suspicion. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when the mask cracked. After Elizabeth's death in 1503, Henry was seen broken, pale and human, in a way few had ever witnessed. It was perhaps the first time he allowed the world to glimpse how much of his reign had been lived in fear, how much his crown had depended upon the quiet endurance of his queen. In the end, their marriage was not a story of romance, but of survival. A chain wrapped in roses, each petal masking the iron beneath. Together they had forged a dynasty that would dominate England for a century, but at a cost neither could truly escape. The world remembered the Tudor rose as a symbol of unity, but for Henry and Elizabeth, it was a reminder that even the most beautiful roses grow from blood-soaked soil. As Henry VII grew older, his crown seemed heavier than ever. He'd won it in blood, and he ruled it with caution, but deep inside he feared one truth. Nothing won in blood is ever safe. The walls of Richmond Palace grew silent, yet his mind screamed louder each night. He saw ghosts in every shadow, the whispers of Yorkist claimants, the laughter of men he had executed, the haunting faces of those who had died so that he might sit on the throne. Every cough in the corridor made him suspect poison. Every hesitant bow from a courtier was a warning. He demanded absolute loyalty, yet he trusted no one. His courtiers obeyed him in fear, but behind his back they whispered of a king consumed by suspicion, a man more prisoner than ruler. His reign, once hailed as the saviour of England after the Wars of the Roses, had turned into a reign of control and dread. Henry believed that every coin he collected, every tax he enforced would buy him safety. Yet gold could not silence the whispers of betrayal that lived inside his mind. By the dawn of the 16th century, Henry was no longer the triumphant victor of Bosworth, but an old man hunched under the crushing weight of paranoia, a king drowning in his own crown. As his mind decayed with fear, his body betrayed him as well. Illness gnawed at him, striking with fevers, sweats, and exhaustion. The once ambitious warrior who had defied exile and battlefields was reduced to a shadow, limping through the echoing halls of his palace. His physicians bled him, purged him, whispered prayers over him. But Henry remained restless, convinced that death itself was just another assassin creeping toward him. The king who had once marched through muddy fields now trembled even while sitting on his throne. His appetite vanished, his eyes grew sunken, and his once sharp presence dulled into a ghost-like figure. His courtiers, ever opportunistic, watched closely. Some wondered how long the Tudor dynasty could survive if its founder crumbled into dust, and through it all the memories of Elizabeth of York, his queen, his fragile shield, haunted him. After her death, his grief only deepened the sickness of his soul. He withdrew further into suspicion, locking himself away, his crown a burden he no longer had the strength to carry. In these final years, Henry VII was not remembered as the warrior who had saved England from chaos, but as a broken man, a king slowly devoured from within. On April 21st, 1509, the end finally came. The once mighty king lay in his bedchamber at Richmond, the air heavy with the smell of sickness and candle wax. His attendants hovered nervously, uncertain whether to show grief for the dying man or relief that his iron grip would soon be gone. Henry's death was not sudden nor peaceful. It was a long, painful surrender. His body shook with weakness, his breathing ragged, his mind still clinging to the paranoia that had defined his reign. Even in his last hours, he's said to have muttered of plots, of threats, of shadows that would consume the Tudors after him. When at last he breathed his final breath, England did not weep for a beloved monarch, but sighed at the passing of a man whose rule had been marked by survival, fear, and endless suspicion. His son, Henry VIII, inherited the throne, a younger, stronger, and far more ruthless heir who would soon eclipse his father's shadow. The irony was cruel. Henry VII had lived his entire life fearing the fragility of his crown, yet in death, he left behind a dynasty that would dominate England for a century. Still, his memory was not of a triumphant saviour, but of a man whose throne was always haunted by ghosts of the past, by paranoia, and by the horrible decay of both body and spirit. Henry VII's life ended as it had begun, in fear. A king who had won everything but never found peace.